Hello, my name is Brad Alge, and I'm the academic director of Purdue's Larsen Leaders Academy. And it's not every day you get a chance to sit down one-on-one to interview one of the leading philosophers of our time. In fact, a self-described public philosopher. I'm here with Tom Morris. Dr. Tom Morris, thank you for joining us and speaking with us here at the Larsen Leader Academy today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. You guys do some amazing things, and I'm just really happy to be a small part of it.
Yeah, I've known Tom probably for 35
Yeah.
years. He was a professor of mine in undergrad up at Notre Dame. And, you don't remember every professor you've had, but Tom is one that has very memorable to me. We've kept in touch, and we invited him here to talk to our students, and he's agreed to sit down with us. So tell us a little bit about your personal journey. You were a tenured professor at Notre Dame. You leave the security of a tenured position and go out to be this public philosopher, which I'm sure a lot of people don't know that that's even a career option.
Right, public philosopher. This is way before there was an Uber or a Lyft to hire us public philosophers. Nobody thought there was such a job. But yeah, I did a double PhDs at Yale in philosophy and religious studies. My area was philosophy of religion. I ascended the ladder at Notre Dame, assistant professor, associate professor, full professor, sharing ultimate questions, ultimate ideas with the students. Some years I had an eighth of the student body in my classes. It was an amazing time. But then business groups started asking me, did the philosophers ever talk about success? Or what did the philosophers say about leadership? Or did the philosophers have any insight about how to deal with times of change? And I would say, well, that's not what I studied in graduate school, but you want me to look into it? And they say, yeah, put together something for us. So before you knew it, I was traveling the world speaking to business groups. I think by the present day, I've done over 1,200 talks for sometimes as many as 10,000 people in a room. A second career I never thought I would have. I loved Notre Dame. I loved the academic life, but I started to feel a sense of calling. I remember Brad telling my wife, there are a lot of great professors in the classrooms, but there hasn't been a public philosopher in America since Ralph Waldo Emerson 150 years ago. Maybe I should bring philosophy to where people are. So that was the overall idea. And Notre Dame said, hey, we'll help support your new adventure, help you start up an Institute for Human Values. And it's been just an incredible adventure ever since.
Yeah, sounds like it. At the Larsen Leader Academy, we like to sort of go back in time, study historical figures and leaders, great books, great ideas, and certainly philosophy is something I think can help inform us quite a bit. One of the core competencies at the Larsen Leader Academy that we have in our leadership model is humility. Yeah. And what can we learn from philosophy about humility and being a better leader?
It's pretty deep in the philosophical tradition to understand that the opposite of humility, sort of a arrogance, a presumptuousness, a grandiosity, leads to all the wrong things. I mean, the oldest human epic, the story of Gilgamesh, from set in 2800 BCE, Gilgamesh was an arrogant leader. He was presumptuous. He was egotistical. He was grandiose. He saw no limits, no laws, no norms that he thought he was limited by. And the people prayed to the gods, help us deal with this guy. That's the way the lack of humility goes across. And then throughout history, Beowulf was a story of a warrior who was the greatest warrior of his time, but had no humility whatsoever. He set himself up for his own demise. So in a book I wrote in 1997 called If Aristotle Ran General Motors, I end the book with what I discovered in the great philosophers was this unusual recipe for greatness in leadership, a balance of the two qualities of humility and nobility together. A sense of nobility, of the greatness of your cause, of the greatness of your people that you're serving, but a sense of your own humility, that you're only a part of the picture. You're only a part of a team. At your best as a leader, you partner up with other people to make great things happen. In fact, the Tao Te Ching, a great book of Asian philosophy, has this amazing statement. The ocean is the greatest of all bodies of water because it's lower than all the rest. They empty themselves into it. To me, that's an amazing model for leadership. The leader is so humble that people want to join with the leader. They want to help the leader. A top executive in a financial services company came up to me once after a talk in Boston, and he said, "You talked about confidence a lot today." He said, "My problem is this, I'm a really confident guy, but I'm afraid if I express that confidence to my people, they'll think I'm arrogant."
Right.
And I said, "Well, why don't you do this? Why don't you make it a habit to always ask other people what they think about this, that, challenge, this new process, this new relationship with a client?" If you're always asking people what they think, well, arrogant people never do that. So when you express your confidence, they will know you are not one of those guys. He said, "I'd never thought of that before."
Yeah, one of the best advice, in fact, my father mentioned this to me when I was growing up, and it's this, you can never get yourself in too much trouble if you frame things in the form of a question.
Yeah, there you go.
Versus an attack or an accusation.
Yeah, or pronouncement ex cathedra, right?
Yes. Do you think humility is something people are born with, or can it be developed or evolved?
Yeah, there are basic personality types that seem more congenial to humility. For example, the introvert as distinct from the extrovert. Nonetheless, I think as a virtue, it's the kind of thing that can be developed. Yeah. Whether you're the most gregarious, outgoing person in the world, you can learn to pay attention to others and put others first. You can learn to have a proper sense of self rather than a bloated sense of ego. So I do think that both this humility and nobility can be learned behaviors. We can get better at those things. And often, Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher, often castigates himself in his meditations, which was just his daily journal to himself. I got this wrong yesterday, I'm gonna try to do it better tomorrow. When people come to executive coaches, and I have a friend who coaches presidents of companies, and he said, they bring me all kinds of problems, personal problems, family problems, their business problems. And after a few years of helping them deal with this problem and that problem, I realized all the problems come out of a lack of self-awareness and a lack of self-management. If I can help people be better self-aware and better self-managed, most of the problems won't even come up in the first place. That has to do with humility and nobility too. If we can become self-aware of how those two things are out of balance in our lives, because they usually are for most people, we can rebalance the equation and then prepare the ground for real greatness in leadership.
Yeah. I think a lot of companies put their high potential leaders through leadership development experiences, rotation programs that are challenging, recognizing that they in fact might fail. In fact, they design failure into the system. And in part, I think, to say, hey, how are you going to deal with humility? Are you going to become more humble in failure? The trick is, how do you do that and not destroy confidence at the same time? And that's a little bit balancing act. You got to kind of you got to have some wins to match some of those losses to kind of get through.
You've put your finger on why so many people come from sports, from athletics of all kinds, into management and leadership positions, because typically they have had their losses along the way, as well as their wins. They've had this sense of humility sort of beaten into them sometimes by their sport, that most sports are in some sense a team sport. Even the sports that don't look like team sports, there's a supporting cast of people in the background, and they learn to depend on these folks. So then when they enter leadership positions, they've got this seed of humility already planted in them. They're going to take their lumps. They're not always going to win. They're going to have to depend on other people. And that's a great formula for entering into interactions with others with a little bit more humility in your spirit.
So this might be a good segue to talk a little bit about something we hear a lot about in leadership today, and that's servant leadership.
Yeah.
And I think when I think of servant leadership, one of the philosophical concepts that comes to mind is the dignity of man.
Yes.
And serving others. What can philosophy tell us about, or what advice can you give our Larsen students about becoming a better servant leader?
Yeah. Philosophers have a long tradition, like Immanuel Kant, of saying that we should never treat other people just as means or tools to our goals, but always as ends in themselves, important in and of themselves. You see these leadership stories, cautionary tales like Moby Dick, where Captain Ahab was supposed to be running the ship for the sake of the owners of the ship, producing a profit, but he takes over the ship for his own selfish purposes, revenge on this white whale, and the ship goes down and everybody's lost but one person who tells us the story. Well, that's a great tale of doing it wrong. The servant leader is a person who doesn't go through life with this bowling ball of an ego rolling down the alley and knocking down all the pins, but is always asking about the greater good, the common good, the good of others, the good of the people on his team, as well as those they more explicitly serve. Servant leadership has been a great concept in modern times, rooted in ancient themes and in ancient concepts. So religious traditions and wisdom traditions, East and West, have given us for centuries and millennia ideas about servant leadership that I am so glad to see being brought into the business world. Just over the last, 10, 20, 30 years, we've rediscovered this ancient concept, which is so powerful, and we can avoid those disasters that some of the great writers tell us about in stories like Moby Dick. And we can see how a leader is supposed to act, rather than the way they all too often act if they're motivated by a sense of grandiosity, a sense of their own tremendous desires or tremendous grievances toward others, like Captain Ahab was.
Interesting. You know, when you think about great leaders and you follow them, a lot of times you'll see that they had some sort of a pivotal event in their lives or adversities that they've had to overcome, or setbacks or failures or some sort of a pain that they had to fight through. When faced with these adversities, is there something that we can draw on philosophically that can put us in a mindset that can get us through difficult times, turbulent times, setbacks even?
Well, I don't think I've ever mentioned Marcus Aurelius twice in the same conversation, but he has this great phrase in his Meditations. The phrase is very simple, and it's best translated as, "The obstacle is the way." And when I first came across that, I thought, well, what does that even mean? The obstacle gets in your way. But he had this transformative idea that we're all to be alchemists. We're all to be transformative with the things that come our way. I actually wrote a book about this a few years ago, the old expression, "When life hands you lemons, make lemonade." I grew up in North Carolina. I must have heard that 100 times growing up as a kid. Tommy, when life hands you lemons, make lemonade. Everybody said it. You kind of knew what it meant, but nobody said how. Well, it turns out the great philosophers have said how throughout the centuries, that we can partner with our problems. Now, this is a fairly new idea for me that just came to mind a few years ago. I was reading Aristotle on the importance of partnership in life. Aristotle said a lot in his book, The Politics, about the city as a partnership for living well. And then you understand in context, he's talking about, well, the neighborhood is a partnership for living well. The family is a partnership for living well. A business as a partnership for living well. So I began to dwell on the idea of partnership. And one day it just occurred to me, we need to learn to partner with our problems. How do you partner with somebody? You watch, you listen, you learn, you bring your best to the situation. And I thought our problems, we tend to try to avoid them, we run from them, we try to get rid of them as quickly as we possibly can. Maybe our problems, as Marcus saw, the obstacle is the way. Maybe our problems come into our lives to teach us something. In fact, I wrote a book about Steve Jobs a few years ago called Socrates in Silicon Valley. And a global businessman from India said to me, "Oh, Tom, you told me something so important about Steve Jobs in your book." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Steve chose problems as big as his spirit." And I said, "Say more about that." And he said, "We all have problems that choose us, that come into our lives unwanted. And they form us as we deal with them. But the problems we choose may actually define us." Steve Jobs, he said, "You taught me," chose problems big enough for his own spirit. And that's why he did such great things despite all his personal debility. So rather than obstacles, adversities, even tragedies being net negative, if we approach them properly in the ways the philosophers have always advised, then we can be transformative. And I look back at my own life and I think, wow, some of the worst things that have ever happened to me have opened the doors for some of the best things, and in ways I could not possibly have imagined. That gives you hope. That gives you confidence. And while there's this famous saying that I've heard repeated so many times, hope is not a strategy. No, it's not. But unless it's behind every strategy, you're not going to be motivated to try. So we talk about grit, resilience in hard times. We talk about resilience, and many people parse that as bouncing back. But I love to say, no, there are two kinds of resilience. There's the resilience of bouncing back to where you were before the adversity. And there's the resilience of bouncing forth in a new arc because of the adversity. I like the people who, like a bounce pass in basketball, are going to give a new arc to their activities precisely because the thing hit the floor. We're going to bounce off in a new, like a spin serve in tennis. We're going to bounce off at a new angle here and learn something from this time we all bottomed out together.
You talk about choosing obstacles as opposed to them letting them happen to us. Brought to mind the Kennedy speech in the space program. We choose to go to the moon and other things like this, not because they're easy, but because they're hard.
That's right.
And there were numerous, obviously, setbacks in the 10 years leading up to landing on the moon, including the loss of Gus Grissom, who's a Purdue alum, among others. So, at the Daniel School of Business, and I think business schools all over, do a pretty good job of preparing students to do the X's and O's, the concrete, tactical parts of business, how to balance a spreadsheet, how to calculate a return on investment, how to put together a business plan. What I don't think we always do a good job of is, why do we do these things? And at the Larsen Leader Academy, one of our mantras, or one of our taglines is to find your why to lead the way. And so I think there's just this natural fit with studying philosophy to try to find that why, to try to find that purpose. Can you talk to us a little bit about purpose and how that has played such a pivotal role?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the greatest tales about success, because it's a cautionary tale, ever written was Mary Shelley's book, Frankenstein. She wrote this novel when she was a teenager, and it's had a huge impact. There have been all the movies made and TV shows, but Victor Frankenstein, her protagonist, is a brilliant man who sets a clear goal, does everything the success and leadership books tell you to do to attain a goal, and he thereby succeeds, launching into the world a monster he can't control that kills everybody he cares about. Now, we're brought up short by this story because this guy seems to be the ultimate of achievement. He does something nobody's ever done, something that'll make him famous forever, creating life from the just organic matter, and yet he didn't have a suitable why. It was all about his fame, his glory, his grandiosity. It was not about anything greater than himself. And when I started pondering this, I realized that meaning and purpose go together in an interesting way in life and in business. Meaning is about connection. Somebody comes in the room and sees a mess. What's the meaning of this? Oh, Bob had to get out really quick. He had a car arrived. He forgot the time he was being picked up, and he just left a mess. You connect up what you see with a greater narrative, a greater story, and it gives meaning to the thing that had no meaning to you. What's the meaning of this? So meaning is about connection. Purpose is about direction. Meaning and purpose are intimately connected, because if you have a noble sense of meaning in what you're doing, that is going to suggest, that connection will suggest a direction for your labors, for your goals, so that you won't be Victor Frankenstein setting just a spectacular goal that ends up being disastrous. You'll end up setting the right goals. So I think you're completely right to ground people in this idea of finding your proper why. Not just any old why. Why do you do what you do? Well, I do this to abuse other people and take as much of their money as possible. That's a why, but it's not the one you want, right? So this kind of connecting up with bigger meaning issues, connecting up with the nobility and humility, with the intrinsic good in other people. If you connect all these things up properly, suddenly you get a why, a sense of purpose that lifts everybody up and helps everybody do their best work, do their most creative work. And that's what we as leaders want to unleash in people.
Well, I love that this meaning is connection and purpose is direction.
Yeah.
Combining those two, meaning and purpose, really kind of crystallizes
Yeah.
two sides of a very important
Yeah,
coin.
absolutely.
I would say. A lot of people would say that artificial intelligence might be the Frankenstein of our day.
Yeah.
In this world of information overload, artificial intelligence, competitive pressures, time pressures, what advice do you have for our young adults, the Larsen leaders, for example, who are going to be going out into the quote real world,
Yeah.
given all of these sort of pressures and
Yeah.
influences that are out there?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned artificial intelligence. I was at a meeting a year ago where one of the major founders of an AI company came running up to me at breakfast, and he said to me, yesterday, Professor, you changed my life. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, I heard you speak about success, and then we had a hallway conversation. You brought me back in touch with my basic values. And now I realize I wanted to help companies and countries adopt AI in a way that was safe and ethical. And you gave me a new idea yesterday. I said, what was that? He said, I want companies and countries to adopt AI in a way that's safe, ethical, and wise. I said, oh, you're talking about AI squared. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, artificial intelligence collaborating with ancient insights. And he said, oh my goodness. He said, I had never, AI times AI. I said, in studying Pascal, for whom a computer language is named,
Right.
1623 to 1662, a great scientist, mathematician, philosophical thinker in France. In reading Pascal, I came upon a principle. He never says it explicitly, but I draw it out of his writings. I call it the double power principle. And it says basically, nearly everything that has power for good has equal and opposite power for ill. It's up to us how we use it. Now that takes us back to the Greeks, who had a principle, again, never explicitly stated, but you can read it in the work of many Greek philosophers. I call it the functionality principle. Hardly anything in this world is intrinsically good or intrinsically bad. Its value is typically in how we use it, how it functions in our lives. Artificial intelligence, like every other major human development, major technological development, is going to be vulnerable to the double power principle, great good, great harm. It's going to be vulnerable to and should be harnessed to the functionality principle. It's up to us how we use it. Will we use the other AI? The ancient insights that have been awaiting a time like this to guide us and direct us? Or will we be Victor Frankenstein, playing things out just unto themselves, hoping things go well? The greatest wisdom is about two things, and we've only been focusing on one of those things in the last 50 years. The greatest wisdom is about guidance and guardrails. Most business literature and self-help personal growth literature of the last 50 years has been about guidance. Do this, do this, do this, do this. We've forgotten the guardrails. But I had a young guy from Madrid come to see me, a college student, and we sit down in a restaurant to have breakfast together, and his first question is not, what's good here, what's good on the menu? His first question is, what is wisdom? He says. I said, whoa, we're getting right to it. Okay. I said, wisdom is embodied insight for living. It's not just slogans, it's not just ideas, it's lived discernment and judgment. And then something came to mind that I had never said before. I said, wisdom is guidance and guardrails. And he was not a native English speaker, so he says, what is guardrails? I said, you're driving on a mountain road, twisty, turny road, and there's a steep drop off. There's a metal railing to keep your car from going off the side. Oh, yes, okay, guardrails. I said, wisdom is to guide us forward, and it's to give us guardrails so that we don't crash along the way. He said, I'd never thought of that. I said, no, I hadn't either until this very moment. With AI, we need guidance and guardrails in order to do it right. I think in this time of technological uncertainty, because of the speed and pace and unknown end of it all, we're going to see people coming back to philosophy, to these ancient insights for both the guidance and the guardrails we need to do it right. And so that's why I'm pretty excited to be with students as they get their imaginative arms around all this.
I love the AI ancient insights.
Yeah,
I'll remember that one. That's great. Well, let's shift gears a little bit and go back in time, a trip down memory lane.
Yeah, sure.
So I was at Notre Dame as a student from 85 to 88, graduated in 89. a 4-year walk-on the football team.
Pretty good, I heard, too.
We were pretty good. We won the national championship in 1988. You had a lot of players, former players. Some of them went on to play in the pros. I wasn't one of them. You know, and you got to observe some of the leadership at the time. In fact, I had a sit down with Coach Holtz before this sit down several months ago, and talked to him a little bit because he was the head coach at the time we won the 1988 national championship. What did you observe maybe about the team, the players, or the leadership from your time there that maybe paralleled some of the things you maybe talked about in the classroom? You had some of these people in your class. And was there any players that stuck out or memories you had of Coach Holtz? Or?
Yeah, it was an amazing group. I mean, the year prior to the national championship, I had, of the 31 freshman football players that year, I had my big freshman intro class. I had 29 of those 31 players. And at the end of that fall semester, I remember I had put together a set of ideas, what the great philosopher said it takes for success in any challenge, success with any opportunity. 7 universal facilitating conditions of success. And the first group I ever talked to about that was a group that included my 29 freshman football players. I hoped they would use these ideas for success in the classroom. I had no idea that some of them were going to use these ideas the next year when they were the sophomore core of the team that won the championship. So I don't claim any credit.
I think there's a causal relationship between the 7 C's and these success that we had.
Well, you know, I talked about it recently when Notre Dame was playing for the championship again this year, and I said, hey, I don't want to claim any credit, but I talked about my 7 C's of success, my 7 universal conditions to the team right before they won the national championship. And Chris Zorich, who was one of those players, he said he saw my post and he said, Professor Morris is absolutely right. 7 C's made me a better competitor on the team, on the field, and in life. And I thought, wow, he and Rocket Ishmael and all these great players of that era, they were grounded. In fact, one of the star running backs asked me to tutor him for a semester in what the philosophers said about success. We did a one-on-one. He'd come into my office every week. But the thing I remember most about that team was not so much just the individual stars who were incredible to watch, but it was their sense of partnership with each other. I remember a slogan, I'm here for you. I remember this attitude, the whole is greater than the part, almost a servant leadership attitude, that every player on the team thought of the team as more important than themselves and wanted to make their best contribution to the guy to their left, to the guy to their right. I remember Chris Zorich in defensive tackle. He was in his stance, and his left hand would be twitching. He could not wait to get that contact, right? To have that attitude about the game, to think that all things are possible, to be motivated by confidence and hope and a sense of what Aristotle thought was such an important thing, partnership, was really the winning ingredient. Sometimes you have great stars on a team, but they can't play together. I saw togetherness on that team. I'm sure you felt it.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. We had a saying, a 2-part saying. First off, who is your friend?
Yeah.
And the answer was my teammate.
Yeah.
And we would have conversations around that. Coach Holtz be up there. Who's your friend? My teammate. That was the answer, always. And then the next question was, who can you count on? Yeah. You can count on me.
Yeah, there you go.
So if we think about a team where that's 100%, I can count on you, and you can count on me. And that was the culture that drove a lot of that success.
Yep. Absolutely.
The last question is related, one of the unique things about Professor Morris is he would give lectures sometimes and he'd pull out his guitar up on stage, remember in the Hesburgh Library at Notre Dame, and start strumming the lecture as was going along. But you've got lots of friends who've written songs, and you even wrote a song. Tell us about the song you wrote back in that time frame, and how you kind of had to maybe put it on delay.
Okay. This was Lou Holtz's first year at Notre Dame, and I could tell even in practice he was turning the team around. They had some difficult years. And I could see it happening in the early semester. I decided he's bringing the team back. I decided I'd write the world's first rock and roll fight song. And it was called The Fightin' Irish Are Back, subtitled Bringing Back the Rock and Roll. And I talked to past great coaches, Dan Devine, Air Parseghian. I talked to them on the phone. Could I use their names in the song? I called the Notre Dame band department. I said, could I have permission to use part of the traditional fight song in a guitar solo to start my song? And they said, well, we don't own the Notre Dame fight song. I said, really? Who owns it? Paul McCartney owns it, of Beatles fame. Are you kidding me? Now, you have to talk to his lawyer in New York City. So I talked to Paul McCartney's lawyer, and he said, look, we've decided to give you 7 bars of the traditional fight song. And don't use any more. It'll cost you a ridiculous amount of money. But I said, I can do that. So I wrote this song, loud raucous rock and roll, the Fighting Irish are back. A month later, I get a call. Professor, this is Lou Holtz, coach of the football program. Well, I know who Lou Holtz is. He doesn't call associate professor of philosophy or whatever I was at the time. He said, I hear you've got this song. And I tell him the story of the song. It's for the students to celebrate the way you're turning the team around and bringing us back to what'll be our glory days. And he said, I got a big favor to ask of you. And I said, what's that, Coach? He said, could you hold off on releasing that song for a year? I said, why? And he said, well, we're going to have a winning season this year. We're going to have a really good season. This is October, his first year. But next year, we're going to win the national championship. So if you will save the song for a year, it will be our national championship celebration song. And I remember saying, okay, Coach, I'll do it if you'll do it. And he said, okay. So I waited a year. We released the song. Champion T-shirts did a shirt with the leprechaun with my electric guitar with my initials on the headstock. The Fighting Irish are back, bringing back the rock and roll on the back of the shirt. We won the national championship. Regis Philbin played the song on his show. They danced to it. You could go to Notre Dame Stadium during a game, and all the tailgaters, you could hear it blasting out of people's boom boxes all over the stadium. Yeah. So there was the coach, that confident a year in advance that he would win the national championship. Now, there was no arrogance in his voice. There was no presumptuousness. He wasn't expressing a hope. He was describing what he thought was going to be a reality. And then he and you guys worked hard to make it a reality.
It was a resolute vision of success that he was committed to, and it rubbed off.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and we were a team at the time when he got there that didn't have a lot of confidence.
And you lost to Miami by what was the score?
58-7. That was sort of the sort of humiliation that led to a decade-long rivalry, the so-called Catholics versus convicts.
I remember
that was turned into a documentary on ESPN's 30 for 30.
Well, that reminds me, I sat on the Miami side of the stadium once on the 50-yard line. They kicked off to my philosophy student, Rocket Ishmael, and he grabbed the ball and he ran and he tripped over something and he went down. But I could see from where I was sitting, somebody had given me seats on the 50-yard line for the only time in my life at Notre Dame. I could see his knee was an inch from the turf. He was not down, but everybody on the field froze. And he took off for the rest of the 80 or 90 yards or whatever it was and made a touchdown. And I said, that represents the whole program at Notre Dame. It was down, but it was not out. And when everybody else froze thinking, well, Notre Dame's out of contention here, boom, in comes Lou Holtz with Rocket Ishmael, with you guys. You take over, you score the touchdown, you win the game, you win the national championship. And it's a story for the ages because it was about adversity. It was about a comeback. It wasn't about just hereditary greatness, you know, as if we jumped straight from Newt Rockne right into, and Joe Montana and the great past, right into winning the championship. You guys went through some hard things, but the obstacle became the way. You guys, like Rocket, took off, and you showed everybody what it takes to win.
Anyhow, we're about out of time. I wanted to thank you, Tom, for sitting down with us and talking, sharing some of your insights and wisdom.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah.